I fought for my life in a dark coma, while my own parents ruthlessly sold off my home and my belongings. They thought my life was completely finished, and that they could simply erase me for a quick financial payout. However, they overlooked one crucial detail in their greedy rush. They missed the hidden steel door behind my kitchen cabinets. That door held a secret that would absolutely destroy their perfect lives and send them straight to a federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments section down below today. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth and fundamentally betrayed your trust. This journey is not for the faint of heart. My name is Zoya. I am 33 years old, and I currently work as an estate liquidator and historical appraiser. My entire job is to find the hidden value in things that other people have carelessly abandoned or forgotten. I have spent my entire career preserving important cultural legacies, but I never expected my own family to discard me. 3 months ago, a reckless driver ran a red light and smashed directly into the side of my small sedan. The violent impact shattered my ribs and caused severe brain trauma. I slipped into a remarkably deep coma almost immediately. The doctors gave me a 10% chance of waking up. For 90 days, I was trapped in a silent, empty void. But I fought my way back to the surface alone. I opened my eyes in a sterile, bright hospital room, expecting to see my mother or my father sitting nearby. I foolishly expected tears of joy and warm, loving embraces. Instead, I woke up to an entirely empty, quiet room. The only sound was the steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor positioned directly next to my uncomfortable hospital bed. The room was freezing cold and completely devoid of any flowers, balloons, or get-well cards from my supposed loved ones. It looked exactly like a room belonging to someone who had absolutely no one in the world to care for them. I pressed the plastic call button with weak, trembling fingers. A few agonizing minutes later, the head nurse walked in. Her blue plastic name tag simply read the name, Marlene. When she saw my open eyes, she literally dropped her metal clipboard onto the hard, cold linoleum hospital floor below. She looked at me, not with profound relief, but with absolute shock and a deep, lingering, unsettling sense of pity. Marlene rushed to my side, checking my vitals with visibly shaking hands. I asked her where my parents were today. My voice was incredibly raspy and extremely weak from the breathing tube they had apparently recently removed from my throat. Marlene refused to meet my intense, searching gaze right then. She nervously adjusted my thin blanket and told me I should just rest. I demanded to know the absolute truth. I am a strong woman who deals in hard facts, and I could easily tell she was hiding something terrible. Finally, she took a deep, shaky breath and pulled a thick medical file from the foot of my hospital bed. She quietly explained that my parents and my younger sister Desiree had visited the hospital exactly 1 entire week ago. They had a closed-door private meeting with the hospital administration. My father Marcus told the attending doctors that keeping me on life support was a massive unnecessary drain on their emotional well-being and their carefully managed financial retirement resources. Marlene handed me a crisp white piece of printer paper. It was a formally drafted "Do Not Resuscitate" medical order. My mother Brenda had signed it with her elegant, sweeping handwriting. They had also officially canceled my health insurance policy, effective immediately, without a single ounce of hesitation or lingering regret. The hospital administration was actively preparing to transfer me to a poorly funded state hospice facility to quietly pass away. They were literally waiting for me to stop breathing forever. My own flesh and blood had eagerly put an expiration date on my life so they could move on rapidly. A normal person would have broken down into hysterical tears right then and there in that depressing, sterile hospital room. I did not shed a single solitary tear that afternoon. The betrayal was so profoundly deep that it bypassed grief entirely and turned straight into a state of ice-cold clarity. I realized in that quiet room that I no longer had a family to rely on in this world. I only had myself, and I needed to protect my valuable assets immediately before they could steal anything else away. I slowly sat up, pushing past the agonizing sharp pain radiating deep inside my chest cavity. I reached right over and aggressively ripped the intravenous needle out of my arm. Marlene completely panicked and practically begged me to lie down, warning me loudly that I could suffer a fatal physical relapse. I completely ignored her desperate, unprofessional pleas to stay put. I demanded the official discharge papers against medical advice immediately. I signed the legal forms with a remarkably steady hand, proving my absolute cognitive competence to the frightened nursing staff. I found my blood-stained civilian clothes inside a plastic hospital bag shoved inside the small corner closet. I dressed myself moving purely on primal survival instinct. I walked completely out of that hospital, boldly refusing a wheelchair. I pulled out my cellular phone, which the nurses kept charged in a drawer, and ordered a rideshare vehicle to take me straight to my house. I desperately needed to get back to my historic stone home immediately. I needed to verify the secure vault. I climbed into the waiting car and stared out the window. My family had absolutely no idea I was coming for my sweet revenge. The tires of the rideshare vehicle crunched softly against the familiar gravel of my long, winding driveway. I pressed my face against the cool glass of the passenger window, feeling a sudden sharp knot form tight inside my stomach. My beautiful historic stone house stood tall against the late afternoon sky, exactly as I had left it 3 months ago. However, something was horribly wrong. A massive, pristine white real estate sign was hammered aggressively into the center of my meticulously manicured front lawn. The word "sold" was printed across it in bold, aggressive red lettering. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly scanned the surrounding area. The long circular driveway was completely jammed with expensive luxury vehicles. There were sleek silver sports cars, blacked-out sport utility vehicles, and pristine white luxury sedans parked haphazardly across my carefully cultivated flower beds. This was not a quick visit or a simple family gathering. This was a massive celebration happening inside my own home while I was supposed to be dying in a hospital bed across town. I handed the confused driver his cash fare and stepped out into the crisp evening air. My legs felt incredibly heavy and incredibly weak from months of absolute muscle atrophy, but pure adrenaline pushed me forward. I was wearing thin green hospital scrubs and a cheap oversized brown fleece coat that I had borrowed from the lost and found bin at the nurse's station. My bare feet were shoved into thin plastic hospital slippers. I looked like a complete ghost, returning from the absolute dead. I suppose in a way I actually was. I slowly walked up the front brick pathway, placing one foot carefully in front of the other. The heavy oak front door was propped completely open. Bright golden light spilled out onto the dark stone porch. I could hear the loud thumping bass of upbeat modern jazz music and the obnoxious overlapping sound of dozens of people laughing and talking loudly. The smell of expensive catered food and rich imported champagne drifted through the open doorway, making my empty stomach churn violently. I stepped over the brass threshold and walked straight into the grand entryway of my own home. The interior had been completely transformed. My carefully curated collection of antique rugs and vintage lighting fixtures had been ripped out and replaced with sterile modern minimalist furniture. Dozens of strangers wearing expensive tailored suits and glittering cocktail dresses were mingling in my living room, holding delicate crystal champagne flutes. Caterers in crisp white uniforms were circulating with silver trays of expensive appetizers. It was a lavish housewarming and renovation party in full swing. I stood perfectly still in the center of the spacious arched doorway, just watching them celebrate my supposed demise. Nobody noticed me at first. I was just a dark shadow lingering on the absolute edge of their bright, wealthy peripheral vision. Then the caterer walking past me suddenly froze. The silver tray in his hands tipped slightly, sending a single crystal glass crashing down onto the hardwood floor. The sharp sound of shattering glass cut through the loud party chatter like a gunshot. Heads began to turn one by one in my direction. The laughter slowly died out. The conversations abruptly stopped mid-sentence. I ignored every single one of the confused, wealthy strangers staring at me. My eyes were completely locked on the center of the vast room. Standing right there next to the grand marble fireplace was my sister Desiree and her husband Brad. Desiree looked absolutely radiant, wearing a tight emerald green designer dress that perfectly highlighted her tiny, pampered figure. She was throwing her head back in forced, exaggerated laughter at something one of the wealthy guests had just said. Beside her stood Brad, looking incredibly smug and deeply arrogant in a custom-tailored navy blue Italian suit. He was the Golden Boy Investment Chief Executive Officer who always looked down on my career as a simple appraiser. He was holding a glass of vintage champagne and smiling like a king who had just conquered a brand new castle. I took one single deliberate step forward into the bright light of the grand living room. Desiree happened to turn her head at that exact moment. The fake smile instantly vanished from her perfectly made-up face. Her jaw dropped completely open, and all the color rapidly drained from her skin, making her look completely pale and incredibly sick. She weakly grabbed onto Brad's expensive suit jacket, pulling on his sleeve. Brad turned around, looking highly annoyed by the sudden interruption. His arrogant blue eyes finally landed on my face. For one long, agonizing second, the entire world seemed to completely stop spinning. The upbeat jazz music playing on the expensive sound system suddenly cut off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence pressing down on the crowded room. Brad did not look relieved to see his sister-in-law awake and alive. He did not look happy or overwhelmed with positive emotion. He looked absolutely furious. His handsome face twisted into a dark, ugly sneer of pure, unadulterated rage. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped right through his fingers. It hit the floor and shattered into 100 tiny glittering pieces, sending expensive alcohol splashing all over his polished Italian leather shoes. He stared at me like I was a stubborn cockroach that he had already paid good money to exterminate. I stood tall, pulling my cheap borrowed coat tighter around my aching body. I did not break eye contact. I wanted him to see that I was not the weak, broken victim he thought he could easily dispose of. I was the absolute owner of this property, and I had returned to reclaim what was mine. He took a single step forward, his fists clenched tight at his sides, breathing heavily through his nose. "You have absolutely no right to be here tonight," he hissed loudly across the deadly silent, crowded living room. I stared right back into his angry blue eyes, refusing to shrink away from his aggressive posture. I calmly reminded him that my name was the only name on the deed to this historic property. A ripple of uncomfortable whispers spread quickly through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. Brad let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly against the high vaulted ceilings of my living room. He quickly reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook. He did not look like a man who was happy to see his sister-in-law miraculously awake from a deep traumatic coma. He looked like a man who was deeply annoyed that his financial calculation had suddenly encountered an unexpected variable. He aggressively clicked an expensive silver pen and began scribbling rapidly on a blank check right there in front of all his important business associates and wealthy friends. He tore the small piece of paper from the leather book with a violent, sharp motion. He stepped right up to me, invading my personal space, and violently thrust the piece of paper directly at my chest. The small paper fluttered down and landed face up on the polished hardwood floor, right next to my bare feet, inside my cheap plastic hospital slippers. It was a check made out to me for exactly $5,000. I looked down at the insulting piece of paper and then back up at his red, angry face. Brad puffed out his chest and spoke in a loud, arrogant voice, ensuring that every single person in the room could hear his cruel declaration. "You were not supposed to wake up Zoya," he said with absolute coldness. "The doctors told us you were practically brain dead, and keeping you alive was a massive financial drain on this entire family. We had to make the tough choices that you were too selfish to prepare for. We used the medical power of attorney to legally take over your pathetic estate. I sold this rotting dump of a house to my own private real estate holding company to cover your massive medical debts and save your parents from absolute bankruptcy. You do not own a single brick of this building anymore. It belongs entirely to my company now. Take that spare change on the floor and go get yourself a cheap cab to a motel. You are officially trespassing on my private property, and if you do not leave right now, I will have the police escort you out in handcuffs." Desiree stepped up right next to him, placing her perfectly manicured hand on his expensive suit sleeve. She placed her other hand on her slightly protruding stomach, rubbing it in a deliberate, exaggerated motion to emphasize her pregnancy. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust, taking in my wrinkled hospital scrubs and my messy, unwashed hair. "Really, Zoya, you are causing a massive scene and stressing out the baby," she whined in her high-pitched, entitled voice. "Brad bought this old house as a favor to you so you would not die in absolute debt. We are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to renovate this outdated trash heap into a proper modern family home for our new baby. You should be down on your knees thanking my husband instead of showing up here looking like a crazy homeless person and ruining our beautiful housewarming party." I did not scream or cry or throw a dramatic temper tantrum. I simply let their cruel words wash right over me like cold water. My sharp eyes flicked past their angry, entitled faces and looked straight down the long central hallway toward the back of the house. I could clearly see the large open archway leading directly into my kitchen. My heart skipped a single heavy beat. The entire kitchen had been completely gutted. My beautiful custom wooden cabinets, my vintage farmhouse sink, and my antique butcher block island were all completely gone. The drywall had been violently ripped away, leaving the bare wooden structural studs completely exposed to the bright construction lights hanging from the ceiling. They were completely tearing the heart of my home apart to build their sterile modern dream kitchen. But as my eyes scanned the exposed back wall of the kitchen area, a deep, profound sense of pure, ice-cold relief washed over my entire body. Behind where the large, heavy antique pantry cabinet used to stand, the wall looked completely undisturbed. The heavy layers of thick protective drywall and the original brickwork in that specific corner were still completely intact. The demolition crew had not reached that specific section of the room yet. They had absolutely no idea what was resting silently right behind that innocent-looking wall. They had not discovered the heavy reinforced steel door securely locked behind the brick. They had no idea about the massive climate-controlled archival vault hiding right under their expensive leather shoes. I slowly pulled my gaze away from the ruined kitchen and looked back at Brad and Desiree. They were both staring at me with smug, victorious expressions, fully expecting me to break down crying and beg for their mercy. They wanted me to bend over and pick up their insulting $5,000 check like a grateful peasant. Instead, I stood completely straight and offered them a slow, chilling smile that made the arrogant smirk completely vanish from Desiree's perfectly painted lips. I did not say a single word to either of them. I simply turned my back on the entire room of wealthy strangers. I left the check lying like a piece of worthless trash on the polished hardwood floor. I walked slowly and deliberately back out through the grand, heavy oak front door, stepping out into the cool, dark evening air. As I walked down the long paved driveway, leaving my stolen home behind, the only sound was the gravel crunching softly beneath my thin plastic hospital slippers. I pulled the cheap brown fleece coat tighter around my aching ribs and whispered softly to myself in the dark. "Go ahead and celebrate, Brad. You have not found the door yet." The cool night wind whipped around my face as I reached the end of the driveway and stepped onto the dark, quiet suburban street. My mind was already racing miles ahead of their pathetic little celebration, calculating my exact next moves with absolute clinical precision. Brad truly believed he had outsmarted me using a forged power of attorney to quickly transfer my most valuable asset into his greedy corporate hands. He thought his expensive lawyers and his flashy investment firm titles made him completely untouchable to a single woman recovering from a severe traumatic brain injury. He fundamentally misunderstood exactly who he was dealing with. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously authenticating historical documents and aggressively hunting down hidden assets for incredibly wealthy private clients. I knew the complex federal property laws and the intricate banking regulations better than his entire team of overpriced corporate attorneys ever could. I reached into the deep pocket of my borrowed hospital coat and pulled out my cellular phone. The battery was critically low, but I only needed it to make a few specific searches. I needed to find a cheap, quiet motel room for the night where I could begin drafting my legal counterattack. I also needed to securely log into my encrypted private servers to verify that the federal heritage protections on my property were still completely active and perfectly binding. If Brad dared to drill into that hidden steel door to expand his ridiculous modern kitchen, he would not just be destroying my personal property. He would be committing a severe federal felony by intentionally tampering with classified historical archives protected by the United States government. He would face a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 solid years in a federal penitentiary. I smiled out into the dark, empty street, feeling the first true spark of genuine warmth return to my cold, battered body. They wanted me to quietly disappear and die, but they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire fake empire. Let them drink their expensive vintage champagne tonight, because tomorrow the real war begins. I walked for 2 agonizing miles under the flickering amber glow of the broken streetlights until I finally reached a dilapidated motel on the absolute edge of the city limits. The neon sign buzzing above the cracked glass of the front office was missing half of its bright red letters. It was a massive downgrade from my beautiful historic stone house with its custom architectural details and its lush manicured gardens. I walked into the dingy lobby smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. I reached into the hidden lining of my brown fleece coat and pulled out a crisp $100 bill that I always kept folded tightly for emergencies. The bored desk clerk handed me a heavy brass key without even looking up from his small, glowing television screen. I dragged my exhausted, aching body up a flight of concrete stairs and unlocked the flimsy wooden door to room 212. The room was incredibly depressing with its peeling yellow wallpaper and a sagging mattress covered by a thin, scratchy floral bedspread. But it was secure, and it gave me the total isolation I desperately needed to execute my next move. I sat heavily on the edge of the uncomfortable bed, feeling the sharp, lingering pain in my recently healed ribs. I pulled out my cellular phone and stared at the dark screen for a long, quiet moment. I decided to make the call I had been dreading, but absolutely needed to make. I dialed the familiar home telephone number of my parents, Marcus and Brenda. The phone rang exactly 3 times before my mother, Brenda, picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she answered in her crisp, authoritative voice that always demanded immediate attention. "Mom, it is me, Zoya," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotional vulnerability. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. For one brief, foolish second, a tiny part of my heart actually expected her to cry tears of joy or scream for my father in absolute relief. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the digital connection. Then my mother spoke, and her words were dripping with absolute venom. "Are you completely out of your mind, Zoya?" she hissed angrily through the phone speaker. "Why on earth did you go to the house and embarrass Brad in front of all his important corporate investors tonight?" I gripped the plastic edge of my cellular phone so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. "I just woke up from a 3-month coma, Mom," I replied coldly. "You pulled my life support. You left me to die in a cold hospital room. And your first concern is that I embarrassed your son-in-law at a cocktail party." My mother let out a loud, exasperated sigh as if I were a stubborn child complaining about a broken toy. "Oh, please do not be so incredibly dramatic, Zoya," she snapped back instantly. "The doctors explicitly told us your brain activity was practically non-existent. Keeping you hooked up to those expensive machines was draining our retirement savings completely dry. Brad stepped up and did this entire family a massive favor by buying that rotting old house from you. He is an Ivy League graduate with a brilliant financial mind. He knows exactly how to handle complex real estate assets. What were you going to do with that massive property anyway?" You are nothing but a glorified junk collector who spends her days digging through dead people's dusty attics. Her cruel words hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to let her hear me bleed. She was shamelessly using my highly specialized career as an estate liquidator and historical appraiser as a weapon to completely invalidate my success. You forged my signature on a medical power of attorney to steal my home, I stated clearly, ignoring her toxic insults. We did what was necessary for the survival of the family, Brenda yelled back, her voice echoing loudly in the small, dingy motel room. Desiree is finally pregnant with our first grandchild. Do you have any idea how stressed she has been lately? She needs a proper large family home in a safe upscale neighborhood. Brad is spending a fortune to renovate your outdated garbage dump into something actually respectable. You should be down on your knees thanking him for taking that massive financial burden off your hands. But no, you always have to be the selfish, bitter black sheep of this family. You always have to ruin Desiree's special moments because you are deeply jealous of her perfect marriage and her incredible lifestyle. I listened to her unhinged ranting with a bizarre sense of emotional detachment. It was like listening to a poorly written script that I had already memorized years ago. Desiree was always the fragile, beautiful golden child who needed to be constantly protected and violently pampered. I was always the stubborn, independent workhorse, expected to quietly sacrifice my own happiness to pave the way for her continuous success. They idolized Brad because he was a wealthy white man who fit perfectly into their desperate climb for country club social status. Before I could respond, I heard a shuffling sound on the line, and my father Marcus took the telephone from my mother. Zoya, listen to me very carefully, he said, using his deep, booming voice that he always used to intimidate his employees at the bank. Your mother is completely right. You showing up looking like a crazy homeless person was completely unacceptable. Brad is the chief executive officer of a major investment firm. He cannot have his unstable sister-in-law threatening his public image. You need to be reasonable and show some basic gratitude right now. We will send you a few $100s tomorrow so you can buy some clean clothes and find a cheap apartment in a much lower-income neighborhood. Let your sister have the beautiful house, Zoya. It is the right thing to do. I did not scream. I did not curse at them. I simply took a deep, slow breath and let the absolute freezing reality of their betrayal harden my heart into solid ice. You both made a terrible mistake, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You bet your entire lives on the wrong horse. I ended the call immediately and tossed the phone onto the cheap, scratchy bedspread. They had absolutely no idea the level of financial and legal destruction I was about to unleash upon their precious golden boy. I lay back against the flat motel pillows, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. Let them think they had won the argument tonight. My phone suddenly buzzed violently against the mattress. It was a text message from Desiree, and it was about to change the entire trajectory of my revenge. I rolled over on the uncomfortable motel bed and picked up the glowing phone. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. Desiree had sent a high-resolution photograph. I tapped the image to open it, and my blood ran completely cold. The picture showed the back wall of my kitchen. The contractors had completely stripped away the beautiful antique cherry wood cabinets and the thick layers of reinforced drywall. What they had exposed was something they clearly did not understand. Sitting flush against the original brickwork was a massive solid steel wall. It was not just a simple metal sheet. It was a military-grade reinforced security door. It had no visible hinges, no electronic keypad, and absolutely no traditional keyhole. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault, completely out of place in a historic residential suburban home. Another text message popped up underneath the photograph. Desiree had typed a long, arrogant paragraph. Brad thinks you hoarded all of your creepy antique trash back here, she wrote, adding a laughing face emoji at the end of the sentence. He thinks you built some pathetic little panic room for your dusty old garbage. Well, you can kiss it all goodbye. The normal contractors could not even scratch the surface of this ridiculous metal wall, so Brad hired a specialized commercial demolition crew. They are bringing heavy-duty diamond-tipped drills and industrial plasma cutters on Tuesday morning. They are going to cut this ugly wall wide open and throw all of your precious little hoarder junk straight into the county dump. You have until Monday night to sign the deed over peacefully, or we are destroying everything you hid back there. My heart completely stopped beating inside my chest. I sat straight up on the edge of the sagging mattress, gasping for air, as if someone had just punched me directly in the stomach. My sudden panic had absolutely nothing to do with dusty antique furniture or old family heirlooms. Desiree and Brad were incredibly foolish and entirely consumed by their own arrogant greed. They looked at a heavy reinforced steel door and saw a minor construction inconvenience. They had no idea they were looking at a Class 1 federally protected climate-controlled historical archive. When I first purchased the historic stone house 7 years ago, I did not just buy a piece of real estate. I bought a secure location to house the most important project of my entire professional career. Through my highly specialized work as an estate liquidator, I had slowly acquired a massive collection of priceless original documents. These were not just old letters. They were incredibly sensitive unpublished manuscripts, direct correspondence, and raw, unedited audio recordings from major leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement. The State Historical Society had personally entrusted me with organizing and authenticating these vulnerable artifacts before they could be transferred to the National Museum in Washington. Because of the immense cultural value and the extreme fragility of these historical documents, I had spent over $200,000 secretly retrofitting the back portion of my house. The steel wall in Desiree's photograph was a custom-built hermetically sealed archival vault. It was specifically designed to withstand massive earthquakes, severe structural fires, and even direct explosive blasts. The fact that Brad was planning to bring commercial diamond-tipped drills and industrial plasma cutters to breach that door was not just a threat to my personal property, it was a direct threat to American history. If those aggressive demolition contractors managed to pierce the protective steel shell, they would immediately compromise the strict climate-controlled environment inside. The sudden violent change in humidity and temperature could instantly destroy fragile paper documents that had survived for more than half a century. Furthermore, the heavy vibrations and the intense heat from the industrial plasma cutters could ignite the highly flammable archival storage boxes. Brad was literally threatening to burn down a priceless piece of our national heritage just so his spoiled pregnant wife could have a larger kitchen island for her stupid dinner parties. I stared at the photograph of the steel door until my vision blurred. A deep burning anger began to rise up from the very bottom of my soul, replacing the cold shock. They had already stolen my house while I was fighting for my life in a coma. They had canceled my medical insurance and waited for me to die. Now they were threatening to destroy my entire life's work and erase a crucial part of our cultural history simply because it was standing in the way of their modern aesthetic renovation. I typed a quick response to Desiree, keeping my message incredibly brief and completely devoid of emotion. I simply wrote, "Do not touch that wall." The immediate reply came back less than 10 seconds later. "Then sign the house over to Brad," she texted back. "You have until Tuesday morning, Zoya. Make the smart choice for once in your miserable life." I tossed the phone onto the nightstand. They thought they had backed me into a completely inescapable corner. They believed they held all the power because they had a forged legal document and a team of expensive lawyers. They thought I would come crawling back, begging them to spare my precious belongings. But they were fundamentally wrong. They had just handed me the absolute perfect opportunity to completely annihilate them. By threatening to forcefully breach a federally protected historical archive, Brad had just crossed an invisible line that moved his actions from simple local real estate fraud into the realm of a severe federal felony. The United States government takes the intentional destruction of protected cultural heritage incredibly seriously. The federal laws protecting those specific artifacts were absolutely draconian. I walked over to the small cracked mirror hanging above the cheap motel sink and looked at my reflection. I looked highly calculating. I was not going to stop Brad. I was going to let him fall. The next morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. The cheap motel mattress had done absolutely no favors for my recovering ribs, but my mind was operating with absolute crystal clarity. I needed liquid capital immediately. If I was going to wage a silent war against my family and their high-priced corporate lawyers, I could not do it with a single folded $100 bill. I washed my face in the rusty motel sink, put my wrinkled hospital scrubs back on, and walked to the nearest local branch of my primary bank. It was a crisp Thursday morning, and I was the very first customer waiting outside the heavy glass doors when they unlocked them at exactly 9 o'clock. I walked straight up to the familiar mahogany counter. The young teller named David smiled brightly when he first saw me. I had been a premium client at this specific branch for over 6 years, managing multiple high-balance accounts. However, his cheerful customer service smile instantly vanished the moment he typed my social security number into his computer terminal. The color drained from his face and his eyes darted nervously between the glowing monitor and my face. He swallowed hard and asked me to please wait one moment while he fetched the branch manager. I stood patiently in the quiet lobby, feeling a sudden familiar tightening in my chest. When David returned a few minutes later, he was not accompanied by the manager. He was walking entirely alone, and his hands were physically trembling. He asked me to hand over my platinum debit card and my primary credit cards for a standard security verification. I placed the plastic cards onto the polished counter without a second thought. Instead of swiping them through the machine, David reached under the counter and pulled out a pair of heavy metal scissors. Before I could even ask what he was doing, he snipped my premium credit card directly in half. Then, he cut the debit card. The distinct snapping sound of the thick plastic echoed sharply across the quiet bank lobby. I stared at the ruined pieces of plastic lying on the counter. David looked like he was about to vomit from pure anxiety. "I am so incredibly sorry, Zoya," he whispered, leaning forward across the counter. "The system flagged your entire portfolio with a severe emergency freeze early this morning. A legal injunction was filed by a man named Brad and your father, Marcus. They submitted certified medical documents to our legal department claiming that you are currently suffering from severe traumatic brain damage due to your recent coma. They officially invoked a temporary medical conservatorship. The bank is legally obligated to freeze every single one of your personal checking and savings accounts until a judge rules on your mental competency. You have absolutely zero access to your funds right now." The sheer audacity of their move was almost impressive in its absolute cruelty. They had not just stolen my historic home while I was fighting for my life. Now they were actively trying to financially suffocate me into total submission by legally declaring me mentally incompetent. They wanted to strip away my basic human autonomy so I could not even buy a hot meal or hire a decent lawyer to defend myself. A normal person would have screamed at the teller or caused a massive embarrassing scene in the middle of the bank lobby demanding their hard-earned money. But I knew that throwing a loud emotional tantrum would only give them the exact ammunition they needed to prove their fake brain damage narrative in court. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked David directly in the eyes and thanked him for his honesty. I turned around and walked calmly out of the bank with absolutely nothing in my pockets. As soon as the heavy glass doors closed behind me, my cellular phone vibrated violently inside my brown fleece coat. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from my father Marcus. His timing was absolutely impeccable. He must have received an automatic notification from his lawyer the exact second my accounts were officially locked down by the bank system. I opened the message and read his arrogant words right there on the busy sidewalk. The text message was long and dripping with fake parental concern, masking a brutal threat. "Good morning, Zoya," my father wrote. "I assume you have visited the bank by now and realized the serious reality of your current situation. You are not mentally well enough to handle your own finances after the accident. Brad and I are stepping in to protect you from yourself. We do not want to see you out on the street. All you have to do is sign the final legal deed transfer, handing the house completely over to Brad gracefully. If you do this without causing any more dramatic scenes, we will immediately unfreeze your accounts and provide a generous monthly allowance so you can rent a cheap, safe apartment nearby. Do not be ungrateful and fight this. We hold all the cards now. I read the message twice. We hold all the cards now. That specific arrogant sentence echoed in my mind as I stood on the cold concrete sidewalk. My father and Brad honestly believed they had executed a flawless financial checkmate. They thought they had successfully trapped a defenseless injured woman by cutting off her retail bank accounts. But their massive fatal flaw was their absolute ignorance regarding the actual scale of my wealth. They only knew about the standard retail bank accounts I used for my everyday personal expenses. They had absolutely no concept of the complex corporate entities, the offshore holding accounts, or the private blind trusts I had established years ago through my high-level estate liquidation business. They thought they had completely starved me out, but they had merely locked the front door to a tiny shed while I secretly held the master keys to the entire bank vault. I walked back to my depressing motel room and locked the flimsy door safely behind me. I sat down heavily on the edge of the sagging mattress and reached deep into my canvas travel bag. I pulled out a heavy black burner laptop that I always kept hidden inside a false bottom compartment. I booted up the machine and quickly connected to a secure, encrypted virtual private network. I did not bother trying to log into my frozen retail bank accounts. Instead, I opened a secure digital communication channel and initiated a direct encrypted video call to my private wealth attorney, Mr. Sterling. He was a brilliant and ruthless corporate lawyer based out of Chicago who meticulously managed the vast anonymous financial assets I had quietly accumulated over my successful career. The encrypted video feed finally connected, and his sharp, intelligent face appeared on my dark computer screen. He looked shocked to see me sitting in a cheap motel room wearing wrinkled hospital scrubs. I quickly explained the entire disturbing situation to him, detailing my sudden traumatic awakening, the hostile housewarming party, and the maliciously frozen retail bank accounts. Mr. Sterling listened silently, taking rapid, detailed notes on his expensive leather legal pad. When I finished speaking, he immediately accessed the county real estate database using his premium administrative credentials. He pulled up the official transfer deed that Brad had illegally filed last month. Mr. Sterling enlarged the digital document on his screen and carefully examined the signature at the bottom of the page. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed quietly in my small room. He told me the forgery was incredibly sloppy and completely amateurish. Brad had clearly traced my signature from an old holiday greeting card or a basic legal document without understanding the complex biometric security measures embedded in my actual official signature. Mr. Sterling explained that any basic handwriting expert could easily prove the document was a complete fabrication within 5 minutes of reviewing it. He leaned forward towards his camera and strongly advised me to contact the local police department immediately to have Brad arrested for real estate fraud and severe identity theft. I shook my head slowly, refusing his perfectly sound legal advice. I told Mr. Sterling that calling the local police would only result in a messy, drawn-out civil dispute. Brad would simply hire an expensive defense attorney post-bail and drag the legal proceedings out for years while living comfortably inside my stolen historic house. I did not want a simple legal slap on the wrist for my arrogant brother-in-law. I wanted absolute and total financial annihilation. I wanted him to lose his company, his personal freedom, and his perfect social standing all at the exact same time. I instructed Mr. Sterling to hold off entirely on contacting the local authorities. Instead, I told him to immediately contact the senior trustee of Vanguard Heritage. Vanguard Heritage was the massive private blind trust I had established 5 years ago to manage my most lucrative corporate investments securely and anonymously. My greedy family had absolutely no idea that I was the sole proprietor of this aggressive investment entity. They only saw me as a simple appraiser who handled dusty antiques for dead people. They did not know that my blind trust had provided the massive $10 million seed funding that allowed Brad to launch his precious investment firm Apex Capital 3 years ago. Brad truly thought he was a self-made financial genius, but he was actually just a highly paid employee, unknowingly working directly for me. I ordered Mr. Sterling to prepare the specific contingency clauses embedded deep within Brad's original funding contract. The contract strictly stated that any felony indictment would immediately trigger a total seizure of all corporate assets by the anonymous angel investor. Mr. Sterling smiled a sharp, predatory smile and immediately began drafting the necessary legal paperwork to execute the hostile corporate takeover. I closed the secure video connection with my lawyer and took a deep, steadying breath. Half of the trap was now perfectly set, but I still needed the explosive trigger. I picked up my cellular phone and dialed a highly restricted government telephone number that I had memorized several years ago. The call routed through multiple secure switchboards before finally connecting directly to the regional director of the Federal Heritage Preservation Bureau. A stern professional voice answered the line, identifying himself as Agent Harrison. I immediately identified myself using my official federal contractor credential number. I informed Agent Harrison that a severe and imminent physical threat was currently developing at my registered Class 1 historical site. I explained calmly that an unauthorized commercial demolition crew, equipped with industrial plasma cutters and heavy diamond-tipped drills, was scheduled to forcefully breach the climate-controlled archival vault on Tuesday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Agent Harrison sounded alarmed by my detailed security report. He demanded to know who had authorized this illegal commercial demolition. I told him my brother-in-law Brad had illegally seized the property and was planning to destroy the federally protected civil rights archives just to expand his residential kitchen. I warned Agent Harrison that the highly specialized archival documents inside would be instantly incinerated if the heavy industrial equipment managed to breach the reinforced steel door. Agent Harrison did not hesitate for a single second. The intentional destruction of a registered federal heritage site is a severe national security issue. He assured me that he would personally coordinate a rapid response task force with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He promised that a fully armed federal tactical team would be waiting out of sight near my property early Tuesday morning. They would allow the foolish contractors to begin the physical breach to secure undeniable concrete evidence of the federal crime before swarming the property and making the necessary felony arrests. I thanked Agent Harrison for his prompt professional assistance and ended the secure call. I set the phone down on the cheap motel nightstand, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settle over my tired, aching body. I had successfully armed a massive legal bomb directly under Brad's expensive Italian leather shoes. My parents and my sister thought they had cleverly stolen my entire life away while I was trapped helplessly in a hospital bed. They thought they had permanently silenced me by maliciously cutting off my retail credit cards, but they had simply pushed me completely into the dark shadows where I operated best. All I had to do now was sit back and patiently wait for Brad to confidently step on the hidden trigger. I lay back on the sagging mattress and closed my eyes finally, allowing my exhausted body to rest properly. The trap was perfectly set and heavily fortified. The federal agents were actively mobilizing. The corporate takeover was fully prepared. Tuesday morning was going to be an absolute bloodbath, and my toxic family would never see it coming. Early the next morning, my cellular phone vibrated aggressively on the cheap wooden nightstand. I glanced at the glowing digital screen and saw my mother calling. I let the phone ring 3 full times before answering, keeping my breathing perfectly even and controlled. When I finally spoke, her voice on the other end was shockingly sweet and completely devoid of the toxic venom from our previous terrible conversation. She sounded exactly like the loving, concerned mother she had always pretended to be whenever her wealthy country club friends were watching. She told me that she and my father had spent the entire sleepless night thinking about my terrible medical situation. She claimed they felt absolutely awful about how quickly things had escalated at the lavish housewarming party. She said families should not fight like this, especially after such a tragic medical scare and a miraculous recovery. She invited me to a private family healing dinner that evening at an incredibly upscale French restaurant located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. She promised that it would simply be a quiet, safe space for us to talk things through and find a reasonable financial compromise that worked for absolutely everybody. I knew instantly it was a highly calculated trap. Narcissists do not suddenly develop a genuine conscience overnight. They simply pivot to a brand new manipulation tactic when the old one stops producing the desired results. I accepted her dinner invitation with a soft, compliant tone, playing the part of the exhausted, defeated daughter perfectly. As soon as the telephone call disconnected, I immediately got to work. I could not show up to an upscale French restaurant looking like a broken, destitute hospital patient. That specific aesthetic played perfectly into their malicious narrative that I was mentally incompetent and physically unstable. I unzipped the hidden bottom compartment of my canvas travel bag and pulled out the thick stack of emergency cash I always kept securely wrapped in waterproof plastic for severe emergencies. I left the dingy motel room and hailed a bright yellow cab, taking it straight to the premium downtown shopping district. I walked into a high-end designer boutique and purchased a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray suit and a crisp white silk blouse. I bought elegant leather heels that clicked against the floor with absolute unwavering authority. I visited a premium luxury salon to have my unwashed, tangled hair professionally wash-styled and blown out into a sleek, polished look. The makeup artist applied subtle but striking cosmetics, entirely hiding the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes and the pale, sickly tone of my skin. When I finally looked at my reflection in the full-length dressing room mirror, the weak victim in the wrinkled green hospital scrubs was completely gone. Staring back at me was a fierce, highly successful corporate professional who quietly controlled millions of dollars in private, anonymous assets. I was fully equipped and absolutely ready for war. I arrived at the exclusive French restaurant exactly 15 minutes late, purposely ensuring they would all be seated and waiting anxiously for my arrival. The sharply dressed maitre d' escorted me through the dimly lit dining room, which was filled with sparkling crystal chandeliers and the soft, elegant sound of live piano music. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my chin held incredibly high as I navigated through the crowded room of wealthy diners. As I approached the secluded private corner booth, I saw my family sitting together. My mother Brenda, my father Marcus, my sister Desiree, and my arrogant brother-in-law Brad were all cramped around the large circular table. But there was a fifth person sitting right next to Brad. He was a sharp-looking older man, wearing a severe black suit and carrying a thick, expensive leather briefcase resting on his lap. When they saw me approaching the table, their fake welcoming smiles completely froze on their faces. My mother actually dropped her heavy silver salad fork onto her expensive porcelain plate, making a loud, sharp clattering sound that echoed in the quiet corner. They had fully expected me to arrive looking completely desperate, incredibly tired, and begging for their financial mercy. Instead, I looked like I was ready to buy the entire restaurant and fire the management staff. I slid smoothly into the empty, tufted leather booth directly across from Brad. I did not greet them or offer a warm, traditional family smile. I simply signaled the passing waiter with a subtle gesture and ordered a glass of their most expensive vintage sparkling water with a slice of lemon. My mother recovered her composure first, completely ignoring my striking visual transformation. She plastered on a fake, sympathetic smile and leaned across the crisp white tablecloth. "Zoya, darling, we are so incredibly happy you decided to join us tonight," she cooed in her sickeningly sweet, manipulative voice. "We just want to put all this ugly business behind us and move forward as a supportive, loving family. But before we can order our expensive steaks and enjoy a nice, relaxing evening together, we really need to handle some minor legal paperwork to protect everyone involved." Before the waiter could even return with my glass of water, Brad aggressively signaled the older man in the black suit. The man opened his expensive leather briefcase with a loud snap and pulled out a massive, thick stack of dense legal documents. He slid the heavy pile of paper directly across the pristine white tablecloth until it hit the base of my water glass. Brad leaned forward, resting his elbows aggressively on the table. He did not bother pretending to be a loving family member anymore. His eyes were completely cold and full of pure, unadulterated corporate malice. "This is my senior corporate counsel," Mr. Davis Brad stated loudly, completely ignoring the quiet, upscale atmosphere of the restaurant around us. "We are completely done playing these pathetic little emotional games with you, Zoya. The medical conservatorship is firmly in place, and your retail bank accounts are completely frozen solid. You have absolutely zero financial leverage here tonight. These legal documents represent an absolute unconditional surrender of all your property rights. It transfers the historic house, the surrounding land, and every single piece of useless hoarded junk you left inside that property permanently over to my corporate holding company. You will legally waive all your rights to contest the deed transfer in court ever again. If you sign this right now, your father will write you a personal check for exactly $10,000 to help you get back on your feet and rent a cheap place. If you refuse to sign, my lawyers will personally ensure you spend the next 5 years locked inside a state psychiatric facility, and you will not get a single red cent from any of us. Pick up the pen and sign the damn papers, Zoya." I looked down at the thick stack of intimidating legal documents and then slowly looked back up at the 5 hostile faces staring at me across the table. My parents were nodding in absolute agreement with Brad's ruthless, illegal threat. Desiree was smirking while casually sipping her expensive fruity mocktail, looking highly entertained by my supposed destruction. They had set up this elaborate, cruel ambush to publicly humiliate me into total legal submission. They thought the intimidating presence of a senior corporate lawyer and the terrifying threat of a forced psychiatric institution would break my spirit right there in the middle of the crowded restaurant. They were absolutely certain they had backed me into a completely inescapable corner with no possible way out. I reached out and gently rested my manicured hand on top of the massive stack of papers. I reached out and gently rested my manicured hand on top of the massive stack of papers. The thick parchment felt heavy under my fingertips. I did not pull the pen from the holder. I simply traced the sharp edge of the top document with my index finger, while staring directly into the cold gray eyes of Mr. Davis. He cleared his throat loudly, leaning forward with an air of absolute false authority. "Now, Zoya, we know you have been through a severe physical trauma." He began speaking to me in an incredibly slow, exaggerated tone, as if he were addressing a confused toddler or a heavily medicated patient. "Brain injuries can cause severe cognitive distortions and highly erratic emotional behavior. We are not trying to punish you here tonight. We are simply trying to protect you from making terrible, irrational decisions that could ruin your future." He tapped the thick stack of papers with his gold pen. "By signing this document, you are allowing your family to shoulder the heavy burden of your complex estate. You clearly do not have the necessary mental capacity to manage a historic property or complex financial assets anymore. It is perfectly okay to admit that you need professional help, Zoya." Right on cue, Desiree let out a sob that instantly drew the attention of several wealthy diners sitting at the adjacent tables. She pressed a napkin against her dry eyes and rested her other hand dramatically over her small pregnancy bump. "You are being so incredibly selfish, Zoya," she whimpered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "Brad and I are trying to build a safe, loving home for our unborn child, and you are actively trying to destroy our family peace with your crazy paranoid delusions. My doctor specifically told me that all this severe emotional stress is incredibly dangerous for the baby. If something terrible happens to my pregnancy because you refuse to cooperate, I will never forgive you." My mother Brenda immediately reached across the table and began rubbing Desiree's shoulder, casting a furious, glaring look in my direction. "Look what you are doing to your pregnant sister Zoya." "My father," Marcus chimed in, his voice low and threatening. "Have you absolutely no shame left in your sick head? Just sign the damn papers so we can all go home and forget this nightmare happened." I let their toxic words hang heavily in the dining room. I looked at their angry, expectant faces and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I slowly picked up the heavy stack of legal documents. Brad smiled a triumphant smile, fully believing I was finally surrendering to his aggressive corporate bullying. Instead of signing the top page, I calmly pushed the entire stack of papers directly off the edge of the table. The heavy documents hit the hardwood floor with a satisfying slap, scattering expensive legal parchment all over the ground. Mr. Davis gasped in absolute shock, gripping the edge of the table. Brad instantly turned purple with pure, unadulterated rage. Before anyone could shout at me, I reached into my designer handbag. I pulled out a single crisp manila envelope and tossed it casually across the white tablecloth. It slid perfectly across the smooth surface and stopped right in front of the senior corporate attorney. I highly suggest you read that specific document before you threaten to lock me inside a state psychiatric facility, Mr. Davis. I said, my voice slicing through the tense silence like a razor-sharp knife. Mr. Davis nervously adjusted his glasses and picked up the manila envelope. His hands were trembling slightly as he pulled out the medical documents inside. The paper bore the seal of the most prestigious neurological institute in the entire state. "What is this garbage?" Brad demanded loudly, trying to snatch the papers away from his lawyer. Mr. Davis held the documents tightly, his eyes scanning the dense medical jargon with increasing panic. "It is a comprehensive psychiatric and neurological evaluation," Mr. Davis whispered, his voice suddenly drained of its previous arrogant authority. "It is signed by the chief neurologist and 2 senior board-certified psychiatrists." He swallowed hard, looking up at me with fear in his gray eyes. "According to this certified medical assessment, your sister-in-law possesses absolute 100% cognitive function. The doctors have officially declared her in perfect mental health with 0 evidence of any traumatic brain damage, memory loss, or emotional instability. She is legally completely competent and highly functional." The table went dead silent. The live piano music playing in the background seemed to suddenly sound incredibly loud. Desiree lowered her napkin, her fake crying instantly stopping as she stared at the medical evaluation in absolute disbelief. My mother, Brenda, opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The fake medical conservatorship that my father and Brad had maliciously filed with my bank was based on the false premise that I was completely brain-dead and mentally incompetent. By presenting a certified flawless neurological evaluation from the top medical experts in the state, I had just instantly destroyed their entire legal strategy. "That medical document makes your temporary conservatorship null and void," I stated calmly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "I have already submitted a certified copy to the bank manager and the local probate judge. My retail accounts will be completely unfrozen by tomorrow morning." Which means, Mr. Davis, that if you or your arrogant client ever attempt to forge my signature on another legal document, or threaten me with forced psychiatric institutionalization again, I will personally ensure you are both disbarred and prosecuted for severe criminal extortion. Brad slammed his fist violently down onto the table, making the crystal water glasses shake and rattle. "You think you are so incredibly smart," he sneered, his face twisted in anger. "You think a stupid doctor note is going to save your precious house from my demolition crew tomorrow morning." I smiled a cold, terrifying smile directly at my arrogant brother-in-law. I smiled a cold, terrifying smile directly at my arrogant brother-in-law. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He could not handle the fact that his expensive legal intimidation tactic had completely failed. Brad suddenly slammed both of his hands onto the white tablecloth, leaning his large frame aggressively across the table. His expensive cologne washed over me, mixing with the smell of his nervous sweat. "You think you are so incredibly clever, Zoya?" He spat, his voice rising above the quiet murmur of the upscale restaurant. "You think a piece of paper from a doctor changes the absolute reality of this situation? You are nothing. You are a glorified garbage collector who spends her miserable life digging through the dusty attics of dead people trying to find a few cheap thrills. You have never built anything of actual value in your entire pathetic life. You just hoard old junk and pretend it makes you special or cultured. Look at you sitting there acting like you actually belong in a high-end restaurant like this. My mother gasped softly, but she did not intervene to stop him. Desiree simply watched with a smug, satisfied look on her face, completely enjoying her husband's cruel verbal assault on her own sister. Brad was fully unhinged now, completely dropping his polished corporate persona to reveal the deeply insecure bully hiding underneath his expensive Italian suit. He pointed a thick, threatening finger directly at my face. "I am the one who brings real money into this family," he boasted loudly, his ego inflating with every arrogant word. "I am the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar investment firm. I manage high-level corporate portfolios while you play with antique trash. I stepped up and bought your rotting house to save your parents from financial ruin. I own that entire property now, Zoya. My name is on the legal deed, and my holding company controls every single inch of that land." He took a deep, ragged breath, leaning even closer until I could see the angry veins popping out on his forehead. "You can wave your little medical evaluation around all you want, but it does not change the physical facts on the ground. The commercial demolition crew is arriving at the property tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. They are bringing heavy-duty industrial equipment. They are going to drill right through that stupid metal door you have hidden in the kitchen, and they are going to throw every single piece of your worthless hoarder junk straight into a dumpster. There is absolutely nothing you can do about it. You have no legal power and you have no financial resources left to stop me." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I sat perfectly still, allowing his childish temper tantrum to completely burn itself out. The other diners in the restaurant were openly staring at our table, now appalled by his loud, aggressive behavior. Even his own corporate lawyer, Mr. Davis, looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting nervously in his leather seat and staring down at his empty plate. When Brad finally finished his pathetic rant, he stood there breathing heavily, fully expecting me to burst into tears or beg for his mercy. Instead, I slowly reached out and picked up my crystal glass of vintage sparkling water. I brought the cold glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the crisp, refreshing taste of the expensive lemon water. I placed the glass gently back onto the pristine white tablecloth, ensuring it did not make a single sound. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table and mirroring his aggressive posture, but replacing his hot rage with pure, absolute ice. "I would not drill into that wall if I were you, Brad," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper that forced him to strain his ears to hear me. I watched the angry confusion flicker briefly in his blue eyes. "It is not what you think." I continued, keeping my facial expression completely blank. "There is no antique furniture behind that door. There are no old dusty paintings for you to throw into a dumpster. What is sitting behind that reinforced steel wall is vastly more powerful than you could ever possibly comprehend. If you instruct those men to pierce that metal tomorrow morning, you will be setting off a chain reaction that you cannot stop. You will lose everything." I could see the exact moment my carefully placed bait hooked directly into his fragile, massive ego. A smart man would have paused to consider my warning. A smart man would have recognized the absolute certainty in my voice and ordered the demolition crew to stand down until he could fully investigate the hidden room. But Brad was not a smart man. He was an incredibly arrogant narcissist who believed his wealth made him completely invincible. He saw my dire warning as a desperate, pathetic bluff from a defeated woman trying to hold on to her last piece of territory. His face twisted into a cruel, victorious smirk. He stood up completely straight, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with a sharp, aggressive motion. "Is that a threat, Zoya?" He laughed, mocking my serious tone. "Are you trying to scare me away from my own property with some fake mystery room? You really are completely insane." He grabbed his crystal glass of water and drank it down in one aggressive gulp before slamming it back onto the table. "I am going to tear that metal door completely off its hinges tomorrow morning," he promised, his voice dripping with absolute malicious intent. "And when I find whatever stupid little secrets you are hiding back there, I am going to burn them right on the front lawn. Enjoy your fake little victory tonight, Zoya, because tomorrow your entire world gets completely demolished." He quickly turned and stormed out, leaving his lawyer in absolute silence. I watched Brad storm out of the elegant dining room, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily against the polished hardwood floor. Mr. Davis, the senior corporate attorney, looked absolutely terrified by the sudden dramatic shift in power. He practically shoved the certified neurological evaluation back into his crisp manila envelope, grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, and scrambled out of the restaurant right behind his arrogant client. Desiree and my parents were left sitting at the large table in absolute stunned silence. They had fully expected to completely crush my spirit tonight and force me into total legal submission. Instead, I had completely destroyed their primary legal leverage without raising my voice a single decibel. I did not stay to watch them awkwardly eat their expensive French cuisine in miserable silence. I simply dropped a crisp $100 bill onto the pristine white tablecloth to cover my sparkling water, picked up my designer handbag, and walked out of the restaurant feeling more powerful and fiercely independent than I had ever felt in my entire life. The crisp Monday morning air felt incredibly refreshing as I stepped out of my cheap motel room. I had successfully neutralized their fake medical conservatorship and armed the massive federal trap, but I needed absolute certainty that Brad would actually trigger the explosion. In the highly complex world of federal property law, intent is often difficult to prove without undeniable physical evidence. If the demolition crew arrived at my historic house and simply tapped the steel door with a basic sledgehammer before giving up, the federal agents might only charge Brad with minor vandalism. I needed a catastrophic, undeniable breach. I needed the contractors to arrive equipped for absolute war. I hailed a rideshare vehicle and directed the driver toward the gritty industrial sector of the city where the commercial demolition company Brad had hired was officially headquartered. The drive took 30 minutes, moving far away from the polished glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district and into a loud, chaotic area filled with heavy diesel trucks and massive storage facilities. The demolition company operated out of a massive, dusty concrete warehouse surrounded by heavy metal machinery and loud grinding noises. I walked into the noisy front office wearing my sharp charcoal gray suit and a pair of dark designer sunglasses. I approached the front counter, projecting the cold, demanding aura of a high-level corporate project manager. A burly man wearing a faded yellow hard hat and a thick canvas jacket introduced himself as the site foreman named Mike. He looked highly intimidated by my premium tailored suit and my sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. I introduced myself using a fake name, claiming to be the senior site consultant personally hired by Brad and his investment firm, Apex Capital, to oversee the residential renovation project scheduled for tomorrow morning. Mike quickly pulled up the official work order on his dusty computer monitor. He confirmed that Brad had requested a standard heavy-duty residential wall removal. I leaned over the dirty counter and looked closely at the digital equipment list glowing on his screen. They were only planning to bring standard masonry saws and basic hydraulic breakers. That was absolutely unacceptable for my specific needs. Those standard construction tools would barely scratch the thick military-grade steel of my archival vault. They would make a loud, annoying noise and cause some minor surface sparks, but they would never actually breach the heavy door. If they failed to completely breach the door, the federal agents might only charge Brad with attempted property damage instead of a severe felony destruction of a protected heritage site. I let out a loud, exasperated sigh, shaking my head with exaggerated corporate disappointment. I told Mike that his standard equipment was going to be completely useless against the reinforced steel structure hidden securely behind the kitchen drywall. I explained that my client Brad was an incredibly demanding and highly impatient investment chief executive officer who expected this specific metal wall to be completely eradicated before his morning coffee break. I actively challenged Mike's professional capabilities, asking him directly if his rugged crew was actually equipped to handle a solid steel bank vault door, or if we needed to immediately hire a more capable industrial firm for the lucrative job. The aggressive challenge to his professional pride worked instantly. Mike's face hardened, and he aggressively tapped his thick fingers against the dirty wooden counter. He proudly declared that his experienced crew could cut through an armored military tank if the wealthy client was actually willing to pay the premium equipment fees. I immediately authorized the massive financial upcharge on behalf of Apex Capital, assuring him that Brad had absolutely unlimited corporate funds and demanded absolute total destruction of the structural eyesore. Mike began furiously typing on his keyboard, upgrading the entire work order. He added 2 heavy-duty industrial thermal lances, multiple diamond-tipped core drills, and a specialized high-heat plasma cutter to the equipment roster. These were incredibly destructive industrial tools, specifically designed to slice through thick, reinforced steel like a hot knife through butter. They were also the exact heavy industrial tools that would trigger the highest level of federal property destruction charges the absolute second they successfully pierced the protective vault door. By pushing Mike to use the thermal lances, I was guaranteeing that the federal agents hiding outside would witness a severe, undeniable breach of a Class 1 historical site. I smiled a tight professional smile and thanked Mike for his rapid accommodations. I explicitly instructed him to bring the heavy equipment right through the front door of the residential property at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and to begin cutting the steel immediately upon arrival without any hesitation or further consultation. I told him Brad would be hosting a small family gathering at the house to celebrate the start of the massive demolition and wanted the loud destructive noise to serve as a dramatic backdrop for his expensive morning brunch. Mike printed the newly updated work order and enthusiastically signed his name at the bottom, completely unaware that he was signing a legal document that would soon become prime federal evidence. I walked out of the dusty concrete warehouse and stepped back into the bright morning sunlight. The trap was no longer just set. It was fully weaponized and aimed directly at my arrogant brother-in-law. All I had to do now was show up to his little morning celebration and watch his entire stolen empire burn straight to the ground. Tuesday morning arrived with a crisp, cool breeze. It was the perfect weather for a high-stakes demolition. I woke up in my cheap motel room feeling completely revitalized. I took a hot shower, washing away the last lingering remnants of my hospital stay. I carefully put on my tailored charcoal gray suit, smoothing out every single crease. I applied my makeup with absolute precision, ensuring my expression looked as sharp and impenetrable as a polished diamond. I slipped into my elegant leather heels, feeling the solid weight of my own authority grounding me. I called a premium black car service, refusing to arrive at my own property in a standard cab. I felt my heart beating with a steady, calm rhythm. I was not walking into an ambush today. I was the ambush. The black car pulled up to the curb in front of my historic stone house. Mike's commercial demolition crew had securely parked 3 massive work trucks directly on my manicured grass. Thick black electrical cables snaked from heavy diesel generators right through the open front windows. Even from the street, I could feel the low, intense vibration of the industrial equipment operating inside. The heavy machinery was humming with a terrifying mechanical power. I paid the driver and stepped out. As I walked up the long, paved driveway, the loud grinding noise of the diamond-tipped core drills and the high-pitched whine of the thermal plasma cutters grew incredibly loud. The aggressive sound of destruction was practically shaking the solid brick foundation of the old house. I reached the heavy oak front door and found it completely unlocked to accommodate the construction workers. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand entryway. Despite the deafening industrial noise echoing from the back kitchen, Brad and Desiree were hosting their arrogant celebratory brunch right in the adjacent formal dining room. I stood quietly in the hallway archway and observed the pathetic scene. They had hired a private catering company to set up an extravagant morning buffet. There were silver chafing dishes filled with gourmet food and tall crystal pitchers full of fresh orange juice and premium champagne. Brad was sitting at the head of the long mahogany dining table wearing an expensive designer sweater. Desiree was seated right next to him wearing a flowing silk maternity dress and sipping a tall mimosa. My parents, Marcus and Brenda, were sitting across from them laughing loudly over the deafening mechanical roar, tearing my kitchen completely apart. They looked like a picture-perfect happy family, completely undisturbed by the fact that they had stolen this house from their own flesh and blood while she lay dying. I took a deep breath and stepped fully into the bright dining room, letting my leather heels click sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp sound caught Desiree's attention first. She lowered her crystal flute and stared at me in absolute shock. The fake, joyful smile slid right off her face. She gasped, dropping her expensive linen napkin onto her plate. Brad snapped his head around, his blue eyes widening in genuine surprise. My parents completely froze, staring at me like I was a terrifying ghost that had just walked straight out of a nightmare. I stood at the end of the long mahogany table, radiating absolute power and total control. I did not look like the broken patient they had mocked or the desperate victim they had tried to intimidate. I looked like a ruthless corporate executive ready to completely liquidate their entire existence. "What in the hell are you doing here?" Brad demanded, his voice struggling to carry over the loud mechanical grinding noise coming from the kitchen. "I told you, if you ever stepped foot on my property again, I would have you arrested for criminal trespassing." Before I could even answer, Desiree pushed her chair back violently and stood up. Her face was bright red with irrational anger. "Get out of my house right now, Zoya!" she screamed, pointing a shaking manicured finger toward the front door. "You are ruining my special celebration. You are completely obsessed with us. And it is absolutely pathetic. Leave us alone." My mother, Brenda, immediately jumped up from her chair, rushing around the edge of the large dining table. She marched right up to me, her face twisted into an ugly scowl of pure parental authority. She completely forgot that I was a grown, successful woman and treated me exactly like a misbehaving child. "You are leaving this house this exact second, Zoya," she hissed aggressively, reaching out to grab my upper arm. "We are completely done dealing with your crazy, dramatic outbursts. I am walking you out that door right now." As her hand clamped down aggressively onto the sleeve of my expensive charcoal suit, I did not flinch or pull away. I simply turned my head and looked down at her hand with absolute ice-cold authority. My gaze was so intensely sharp and completely devoid of any familial warmth that my mother actually gasped. I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers, locking her in a terrifying, silent stare. "Take your hand off me, Brenda," I commanded, my voice cutting through the loud machinery noise with absolute deadly precision. "You lost the right to touch me the exact moment you signed my do not resuscitate order. If you do not remove your hand immediately, I will personally press charges for physical assault." My mother let out a small, terrified squeak and snatched her hand back as if my suit jacket had suddenly caught on fire. She took 2 clumsy steps backward, bumping into the edge of the heavy mahogany table. She looked completely shaken by my absolute lack of emotional compliance. I smoothed out the invisible wrinkle on my sleeve and turned my attention back to Brad. He was standing up now, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of fake masculine dominance. I smiled a cold, chilling smile and walked slowly toward the head of the table. I smiled a cold, chilling smile and walked slowly toward the head of the table. Brad did not back down. He aggressively reached into his expensive leather briefcase, resting on the floor beside his chair, and pulled out a thick folder. He ripped out a single piece of heavy legal parchment and shoved it directly into my face. It was the forged property deed. "You are officially trespassing on private corporate property, Zoya," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly from his intense anger. "My holding company owns this entire estate lock, stock, and barrel. My signature is on the final transfer line and the county clerk has already processed the formal paperwork. I am the absolute legal owner of this property and I am ordering you to leave immediately, before I have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs. I did not even look at the fraudulent piece of paper trembling in his sweaty hand. I kept my eyes locked entirely on his flushed, angry face. You do not own a single thing, Brad, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the loud grinding noises echoing from the kitchen. In fact, you do not even own the expensive Italian sweater you are wearing right now. Your entire life is nothing but an elaborate, highly leveraged illusion. Brad let out a harsh, mocking laugh, but I could see a sudden flicker of genuine panic flash deep inside his blue eyes. You are completely delusional, he sneered, looking around the dining table to gather support from Desiree and my parents. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I know that Apex Capital is currently carrying $8.5 million in toxic corporate debt, I stated loudly and clearly. The mocking smile instantly vanished from Brad's face. He dropped his arm, letting the forged deed flutter down onto the mahogany table. I know that you have personally defaulted on 3 separate mezzanine loans in the last 6 months. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to him. I know that your primary investors are actively preparing to file a massive class action lawsuit against you for severe financial mismanagement and corporate fraud. Your prestigious investment firm is completely bankrupt, Brad. You are absolutely drowning in high-interest debt and you are completely desperate. Desiree looked rapidly back and forth between her husband and me, her eyes wide with sudden confusion. Brad, what is she talking about? Desiree asked, her voice trembling slightly. Tell her to shut up and get out. She is talking about the real reason your wonderful husband decided to steal my historic home while I was fighting for my life in a coma. I answered, keeping my gaze entirely fixed on Brad. He did not buy this property to save our parents from my medical debt. That was a pathetic, convenient lie. He forged my signature on a medical power of attorney and stole this estate because he desperately needed a massive, unencumbered physical asset to use as collateral. He secretly pledged my historic stone house to a group of shady private lenders to secure a high-interest bridge loan. He needed the fast cash to briefly prop up his failing company and keep himself out of federal prison. He is literally tearing my kitchen apart right now to artificially inflate the property appraisal value before the lenders officially audit his fake financial records. The dining room fell incredibly silent. Even the heavy industrial machinery in the kitchen seemed to briefly pause its destructive grinding. Brad stood completely frozen, staring at me with his mouth slightly open. His face had gone completely pale, draining of all its arrogant color. How in the hell do you know those specific numbers? Brad whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the diesel generators outside. Before I could answer him, my father Marcus aggressively slammed his fist down onto the table. That is absolutely enough of your sick, jealous lies, Zoya, he yelled, standing up to aggressively defend his precious son-in-law. I will not sit here and let you slander Brad's good name with this completely fabricated financial nonsense. Brad is a brilliant chief executive officer. He manages massive portfolios. He would never steal anything. He stepped up and saved this family when you selfishly decided to become a massive financial burden to us. My mother Brenda quickly nodded in absolute agreement, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. She is just insanely jealous, Marcus, she said, glaring at me with pure maternal hatred. She has always been incredibly jealous of Desiree and Brad. She is making up these ridiculous stories about corporate debt to ruin their beautiful housewarming celebration because she cannot stand to see her sister living a successful, happy life. Brad is a good, honest man, and we trust him completely. I looked at my parents, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute pity for their willing ignorance. They were so utterly blinded by their desperate need for country club status and the illusion of a wealthy son-in-law that they were actively defending the exact man who was currently destroying their family. They were completely willing to throw their own flesh and blood directly under the bus just to maintain their fake, perfect suburban image. You really are complete fools, I said, shaking my head slowly. You mortgaged your own retirement home last year to invest $200,000 into Apex Capital, did you not? My father flinched, as if I had physically struck him. Yes, I know all about your secret little investment. I continued, my voice dripping with cold contempt. Brad took your retirement money and immediately burned it to pay off his angry creditors. Your money is completely gone, Marcus. Brad suddenly lunged aggressively forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table. Shut your stupid mouth right now, Zoya! He aggressively screamed, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure absolute desperation. Before Brad could take another aggressive step toward me, a deafening explosive sound erupted from the kitchen. It was a massive, violent grinding noise that shook the solid hardwood floor beneath our feet. The heavy industrial thermal lances had finally reached the absolute breaking point of the reinforced military-grade steel. A bright flash of blue light briefly illuminated the hallway, followed immediately by the sharp, acrid smell of melting metal and burning ozone. The sudden, heavy silence that fell over the house was almost more terrifying than the deafening construction noise. The loud, chaotic grinding was instantly replaced by the soft hiss of cooling metal and the frantic shouting of the demolition crew in the back room. Brad froze, his hands still gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his face completely pale. Desiree let out a small, frightened gasp, clutching her pregnant stomach. My mother and father stared toward the kitchen hallway, their eyes wide with sudden confusion. Heavy boots pounded rapidly against the hardwood floor. Mike, the burly site foreman I had spoken to the previous day, sprinted into the formal dining room. He was covered in thick gray concrete dust, and his yellow hard hat was pushed far back on his head. His face was completely drained of the confident, arrogant swagger he had displayed at the warehouse. He looked absolutely terrified. Mr. Brad, we broke through the steel wall, Mike panted, wiping a thick layer of dirty sweat from his forehead with the back of his heavy leather work glove. The heavy door is completely wide open right now, but sir, you really need to come back there and see this right now. Brad slowly stood up, completely straight, quickly adjusting the collar of his expensive designer sweater. He desperately tried to forcefully rebuild his shattered corporate facade in front of his wealthy in-laws. He took a deep breath, attempting to slow his racing heart. What exactly is the problem, Mike? Brad asked, his voice still shaking slightly from our previous intense confrontation. Did you find a massive pile of moldy antique furniture blocking your path? Just throw it all into the industrial dumpster outside, exactly like I paid you to do. Mike shook his head vigorously, his eyes darting nervously between Brad and me. No, sir, you do not understand. Mike insisted, his voice trembling with genuine panic. There is absolutely no old furniture back there. We just cut into a massive climate-controlled room. It looks like a high-tech laboratory or a bank vault. I have been doing commercial demolition for 20 years, and I have never seen anything like this inside a residential suburban home. We stopped all the heavy machinery immediately because we think we just destroyed something incredibly expensive. Instead of listening to the absolute terror in the experienced foreman voice, Brad completely misinterpreted the situation. His massive, fragile ego immediately seized the opportunity to regain absolute control of the room. The intense panic that had gripped him just moments before completely vanished entirely, replaced by a wave of cruel, triumphant arrogance. He actually threw his head back and laughed loudly. The sound was harsh and incredibly grating, echoing awkwardly in the quiet dining room. Brad looked at me with pure malicious joy dancing in his bright blue eyes. "Oh, this is absolutely priceless," he mocked, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You actually spent your own hard-earned money to build a secret high-tech panic room for your worthless little paper collection. You are even more pathetic and paranoid than I originally thought, Zoya. You probably thought hiding your dusty garbage behind a thick steel door would actually stop me from claiming what is rightfully mine." He turned toward my parents, spreading his arms wide like a victorious circus ringmaster. "Come on, Marcus," and Brad announced loudly, his voice dripping with fake enthusiastic charm. Let us all go take a good long look at the secret paranoid world of your completely insane daughter. Let us go look at the worthless trash Zoya cared about more than her own flesh and blood. After we have a good laugh at her ridiculous expense, I am going to personally carry the first box of her precious garbage out to the dumpster. Desiree smiled a wicked, satisfied smile, completely forgetting the serious financial allegations I had just exposed moments earlier. She eagerly grabbed Brad's arm, and they began marching confidently toward the kitchen hallway. My mother and father quickly followed right behind them, eager to witness my final, ultimate humiliation. Mike the foreman stood off to the side looking incredibly uncomfortable as the wealthy family completely ignored his serious professional warnings. I did not say a single word to stop them. I simply fell into step behind my parents, walking with a slow, deliberate rhythm. We left the pristine, elegant dining room and stepped into the absolute chaos of the gutted kitchen. The air was thick with gray plaster dust and the sharp chemical smell of vaporized steel. At the far end of the room, the massive Federal Heritage Vault was completely exposed. The demolition crew had used the thermal lance to carve a massive jagged hole directly through the center of the heavy steel door. The thick metal edges of the massive breach were still glowing a dull, angry red, radiating intense waves of heat into the kitchen. The heavy locking bolts had been completely melted away, allowing the massive heavy door to swing lazily open on its reinforced titanium hinges. Through the jagged smoking hole, the bright sterile LED lights of the climate-controlled archive spilled out into the dusty kitchen. Brad stood directly in front of the ruined door, his hands resting confidently on his hips. He leaned his arrogant head through the smoking opening, completely ready to loudly laugh at my destroyed life work. He had absolutely no idea that he was actually looking directly into his own inescapable federal prison cell today. Brad leaned his head further into the jagged opening of the steel door. He squinted against the bright, sterile lights inside the vault, expecting to see towering piles of rotting wood and dusty, worthless knickknacks. Instead, his confused eyes met rows upon rows of pristine, climate-controlled glass display cases and perfectly aligned archival storage boxes. There were no garbage bags or hoarder piles. There was only a highly organized, extremely sterile environment that looked exactly like a secure wing of a major national museum. I watched his broad shoulders stiffen as his arrogant brain desperately tried to process the completely unexpected visual information. Before he could even open his mouth to ask a single question, a low, rhythmic vibration began to shake the wooden floorboards beneath our feet. It did not sound like the heavy diesel generators powering the demolition equipment. This sound was coming from above us. The low vibration rapidly escalated into a deafening mechanical roar. A massive dark shadow swept across the bright morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. The deafening sound of heavy rotor blades chopping violently through the air completely drowned out the steady humming of the industrial machinery. A massive tactical helicopter was hovering incredibly low directly over the roof of my historic stone house. The intense downdraft from the spinning blades whipped the surrounding trees into a violent frenzy and rattled the old glass window panes so hard I thought they were going to instantly shatter. Desiree let out a piercing scream of absolute terror, covering her ears with both hands. My mother and father stumbled backward away from the ruined kitchen wall, looking frantically up at the ceiling in total panic. Brad pulled his head out of the vault, completely abandoning his arrogant posture. He spun around, looking wildly toward the front hallway. "What is going on?" he yelled, his voice barely audible over the deafening helicopter noise. "Who is flying that thing over my property?" His angry question was immediately answered by the shrill, piercing wail of dozens of emergency sirens suddenly converging on the quiet suburban street from every possible direction. The loud screeching of heavy tires burning against the asphalt echoed through the neighborhood. I calmly walked over to the side window and looked out at the front lawn. Exactly as Agent Harrison had promised, the Rapid Response Task Force had arrived with absolute overwhelming force. 5 massive black sport utility vehicles completely ignored the paved driveway and tore aggressively straight across the pristine manicured grass. They violently crushed my mother's favorite rose bushes and skidded to a chaotic halt, forming a tight tactical perimeter around the entire house. Heavy reinforced doors flew open before the vehicles even completely stopped moving. Dozens of heavily armed men and women poured out onto the lawn, moving with terrifying military precision. They were completely clad in dark tactical gear, wearing heavy Kevlar vests and carrying specialized assault rifles. In the middle of the chaotic swarm, several agents were wearing bright yellow windbreakers with the words Federal Heritage Bureau printed across the back in bold black letters. Move, move, move. A loud, authoritative voice boomed over a heavy bullhorn, completely drowning out the neighborhood sirens. We have a confirmed breach of a Class 1 federal site. Secure the perimeter and breach the front entrance immediately. Inside the kitchen, the demolition foreman Mike took one single look out the window and instantly recognized the absolute gravity of the situation. Without hesitating for a fraction of a second, the burly construction worker dropped hard to his knees on the dusty floor and locked both of his hands securely behind his yellow hard hat. He knew exactly what an armed federal raid looked like, and he had absolutely no intention of getting shot over a residential kitchen renovation. Brad, on the other hand, was completely paralyzed by his own massive ego. He stood frozen in the center of the dusty kitchen, staring blindly down the long hallway toward the front door. "This is a mistake," he muttered, shaking his head in total denial. "This has to be a massive mistake. I am a corporate chief executive officer. They cannot do this to me." The heavy oak front door did not simply open. It was violently kicked off its iron hinges with a deafening crash that echoed through the entire estate. The heavy wood splintered and shattered against the hallway wall. A flood of armed federal agents poured into the grand entryway, swarming the elegant housewarming brunch like a highly trained army of dark ants. They knocked over the silver chafing dishes and trampled the expensive gourmet food under their heavy combat boots. Federal Bureau of Investigation. An agent screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing fiercely down the hallway. "Drop to the ground immediately. Keep your hands where we can see them. Get down on the ground right now." The armed tactical team aggressively flooded into the kitchen area, spreading out instantly to secure the chaotic room. They leveled their heavy weapons directly at the stunned family members. My mother, Brenda, let out a pathetic whimpering sound and slowly sank to the dusty floor, completely ruining her expensive designer dress. She raised her shaking hands into the air, her eyes wide with absolute terror. My father, Marcus, followed immediately, dropping awkwardly to his knees beside her, completely stripped of his fake country club dignity. Desiree stood completely frozen, crying hysterically and awkwardly, clutching her pregnant stomach until a female agent firmly grabbed her shoulder and forced her down onto the hardwood floor. I did not panic or resist the chaotic federal intrusion. I simply took a slow, deliberate step away from the smoking vault door and raised my hands calmly into the air, showing my empty palms to the approaching agents. I kept my face completely blank, allowing the highly trained professionals to easily secure the active crime scene without any unnecessary resistance. Brad was the only one who completely refused to comply with the federal orders. He was standing directly in front of the destroyed vault door, his expensive sweater covered in gray plaster dust. His face was a mask of pure, arrogant outrage. He actually took an aggressive step toward the lead FBI agent, completely ignoring the heavy assault rifle pointed directly at his chest. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Brad shouted, his voice completely unhinged and dripping with entitled fury. "You have absolutely no right to break into my private home. I own this property, and I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this ridiculous circus right now." The lead tactical agent did not flinch. He did not engage in a polite conversation or care about Brad's fake corporate titles. The agent simply stepped forward quickly, grabbed Brad by the collar of his expensive designer sweater, and forcefully swept his legs out from under him. Brad hit the dusty hardwood floor with a heavy, agonizing thud, the breath completely knocked out of his lungs. Before he could even gasp for air, two heavy combat boots pinned him firmly to the ground, and cold steel handcuffs clicked violently around his wrists. Brad struggled violently against the cold steel handcuffs biting painfully into his wrists. He writhed on the dusty hardwood floor, twisting his expensive tailored suit into a ruined mess of gray plaster and dirt. He continued to scream ridiculous threats at the heavily armed tactical agents demanding his immediate release and threatening to sue the entire federal government for millions of dollars. The lead agent completely ignored his pathetic temper tantrum. He simply pressed his heavy combat boot a fraction of an inch deeper into the center of Brad's back, pinning him securely to the floor, like a captured insect. I watched him struggle for a few deeply satisfying seconds before I slowly stepped forward into the center of the chaotic kitchen. I smoothed down the lapels of my charcoal gray suit and approached the lead tactical agent with absolute calm authority. "My name is Zoya, and I am the federally registered custodian of this property," I stated clearly, projecting my voice over Brad's muffled shouting. I reached into my designer handbag and produced my laminated federal contractor identification badge, holding it up for the tactical agents to clearly see. I pointed my manicured index finger directly down at my arrogant brother-in-law on the floor. "Officer, that man just intentionally ordered the commercial destruction of a Class 1 protected federal historic site." Brad let out a harsh, breathless laugh from the floor, spitting gray plaster dust from his mouth. "She is completely insane," he wheezed frantically, trying to look up at the federal agents holding him down. "She is a bitter, jealous hoarder. That is my house, and that room is completely filled with her worthless garbage and old broken furniture. You are arresting the wrong person. Tell them, Zoya. Tell them it is just your stupid antique trash." He was still desperately trying to spin his fake narrative, but his words sounded incredibly hollow and pathetic, echoing in a room filled with heavily armed federal law enforcement officers. Before I could respond, a tall, older man wearing a crisp yellow Federal Heritage Bureau windbreaker stepped through the ruined kitchen doorway. It was Agent Harrison, the regional director I had spoken with on the secure encrypted line yesterday. He carefully stepped over the ruined pieces of drywall and walked directly toward the smoking jagged hole in the massive steel door. He pulled a specialized thermal sensor from his tactical belt and quickly scanned the interior of the breached vault. His professional face tightened into a mask of pure, absolute fury when he saw the glowing red metal edges threatening the strict climate-controlled environment inside. "Get heavy industrial ventilation fans in here immediately," Agent Harrison barked over his shoulder to his tactical team. "We need to rapidly stabilize the ambient temperature before the residual heat from that plasma breach compromises the humidity levels inside the primary archive." Two agents immediately sprinted out the front door to retrieve the specialized environmental equipment. Agent Harrison turned slowly around and looked directly down at Brad. His eyes were cold and completely devoid of any human sympathy. "You incredibly foolish, arrogant man," Agent Harrison said, his voice practically vibrating with barely contained anger. "You think this vault contains old furniture. You think we scramble a fully armed federal tactical team and a military helicopter for a pile of dusty antiques." Agent Harrison gestured toward the pristine, sterile room, glowing just beyond the ruined steel door. "That climate-controlled archival vault currently holds over 200 original unpublished manuscripts, direct personal correspondence, and incredibly fragile audio recordings from the most prominent leaders of the American civil rights movement. Those glass display cases hold the original handwritten letters of major civil rights leaders. They are completely irreplaceable cultural artifacts legally entrusted to this woman for emergency preservation." The absolute silence that fell over my toxic family was incredibly profound. Desiree stopped her hysterical fake crying completely. She sat frozen on the dusty floor, her hands slowly slipping away from her pregnant stomach as the terrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. My father, Marcus, stared at the vault with his mouth hanging wide open, completely unable to comprehend the massive historical value hidden right inside my home. My mother, Brenda, began to physically shake violently, her eyes darting back and forth between me and the federal agents. Brad suddenly stopped struggling against the cold steel handcuffs. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He finally realized that his arrogant greed had pushed him far past the point of a simple civil dispute and straight into the terrifying realm of severe national security. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, looking down into his wide, panicked blue eyes. By hiring a commercial demolition crew and ordering them to forcefully pierce that protective steel wall, you did not just commit simple property damage, Brad. I explained, my voice echoing coldly in the dusty kitchen. You intentionally tampered with a federally protected cultural heritage site. Under the strict guidelines of the National Antiquities Act and federal heritage protection statutes, that action is a severe federal felony. I paused for a brief second, allowing my next words to strike him with maximum devastating impact. Because you used heavy industrial thermal lances to breach a designated secure facility, you are currently facing a mandatory minimum sentence of exactly 10 solid years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There is absolutely no possibility of early parole for this specific classification of federal crime. You are not going to a comfortable white-collar resort prison, Brad. You are going to a hard, federal facility for a very long time. Desiree let out a sudden, blood-curdling scream of pure, unadulterated agony. No! She wailed, thrashing wildly against the female agent holding her firmly down on the floor. He is my husband. He is a corporate chief executive officer. You cannot take him away like some common violent criminal today. Desiree's hysterical cries echoed off the dusty walls, but the federal agents did not even pause their precise movements. The female agent keeping Desiree pinned to the floor simply instructed her to remain completely still and quiet if she did not want to be arrested for actively interfering with an ongoing federal investigation. Desiree clamped her hands over her mouth, sobbing violently into her palms. On the floor, Brad was hyperventilating loudly. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified little boy instead of the arrogant corporate titan he constantly pretended to be. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked tighter around his wrists, biting painfully into his soft skin. Two highly muscular tactical agents grabbed him firmly by the arms and forcefully hauled him to his feet. He swayed unsteadily, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the thick layer of gray plaster dust covering the hardwood floor. My mother, Brenda, suddenly found her voice again. She scrambled up from the ruined floor, completely ignoring the heavy dirt staining her expensive designer dress, and lunged desperately toward Agent Harrison. "You are making a terrible mistake," she cried out, her voice shaking with absolute panic. "You simply do not understand who you are dealing with here today. This is Brad. He is a highly respected chief executive officer in the downtown financial district. He manages multi-million-dollar portfolios for very important wealthy people. He is not a violent criminal. He just bought this old house to help our family out of a tough financial spot." My father Marcus quickly joined her, nodding his head vigorously and waving his hands wildly in the air. "He is a good, honest man," Marcus shouted, trying to project his usual demanding authority. "He has a pregnant wife and a pristine reputation in our community. You cannot just march into a private residence and drag a wealthy businessman away over some dusty old papers. I demand that you unhand my son-in-law right this instant." Agent Harrison looked at my delusional parents with absolute professional disgust. He did not care about their country club memberships, their expensive clothes, or their fake suburban prestige. "Federal law does not care about his corporate title or his bank account balance, ma'am," Agent Harrison replied coldly, stepping deliberately between my frantic parents and the handcuffed prisoner. "Your wealthy businessman just intentionally ordered the violent destruction of American national history. He will be processed exactly like any other federal felon." Brad stood there trembling violently. He looked desperately at me, his blue eyes wide with pure, pathetic terror. "Zoya, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, humiliating whine. "Please tell them to stop. Tell them we can work this out privately like a family. I will give the house back to you right now today. I will pay for all the damages to the metal door. Just call them off, Zoya, please. I am begging you. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the pathetic man crying in front of me. I calmly opened my designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, thick folder. I did not need to call them off, Brad, because the federal property damage is actually the least of your massive legal problems today, I said, my voice slicing cleanly through his desperate begging. I pulled a thick stack of certified legal documents from the manila folder and handed them directly to the lead FBI agent standing right next to Brad. These are the certified original property deeds to this historic estate. I explained clearly, ensuring every single person in the room heard my exact words. I have also included the sworn affidavits from my private wealth attorney and the senior bank fraud department. They contain absolute concrete proof that Brad used a completely forged medical power of attorney to illegally transfer my property into his corporate holding company while I was fighting for my life in a hospital coma. The lead FBI agent quickly scanned the certified documents. His sharp eyes narrowed as he read the undeniable proof of the incredibly sloppy signature forgery. The biometric handwriting analysis explicitly proved that Brad had traced my name onto the legal transfer forms. The agent looked up from the heavy stack of papers and stared directly at Brad with cold, professional contempt. "Well, it looks like today is your absolute unlucky day, Brad," the agent stated firmly, pulling out a small black notepad from his tactical vest. "In addition to the severe federal heritage destruction charges, you are now officially under arrest for grand larceny, severe identity theft, and massive real estate fraud. Because you used these completely fraudulent documents to secure high-interest corporate loans across state lines, we will also be actively adding federal wire fraud to your rapidly growing list of severe felony charges. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The devastating words hung heavily in the dusty kitchen air. Grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, federal heritage destruction. Each individual criminal charge carried years of mandatory prison time. Combined, they represented an absolute death sentence for Brad's entire life. He would never see the inside of a corporate boardroom ever again. He would never wear another expensive Italian suit or drink vintage champagne at an exclusive country club. His entire arrogant existence was completely over. He slumped forward, his knees practically buckling under the massive, crushing weight of his newly destroyed reality. The two strong agents had to physically hold him upright by his armpits to prevent him from collapsing entirely onto the dusty floor. Desiree let out another piercing wail, finally understanding that her perfect, wealthy husband was going to prison for the rest of his natural life. She looked at me with absolute hatred, but I simply smiled back at her, knowing the absolute worst was actually still yet to come for them. Brad suddenly stopped sagging against the federal agents holding his arms. A fresh wave of desperate adrenaline seemed to briefly overpower his terror. He violently jerked his shoulders back, lifting his chin to glare directly at me. "You think this is over, Zoya?" he screamed, spraying spit and dust onto the floor. "You think local cops are going to keep me locked up? My corporate lawyers will completely destroy you and your fake little heritage site. Apex Capital is a multi-million-dollar firm. I have limitless capital at my disposal. I will post whatever massive bail the judge sets and bury you in endless civil litigation. I will sue you for defamation and malicious prosecution. My company has the power to crush you completely." I listened to his unhinged ranting with a deeply amused expression. He was clinging desperately to the illusion of his corporate power, refusing to accept that his foundation was built on quicksand. I slowly walked right past the heavily armed tactical team, carefully stepping over the shattered drywall and ruined plaster. I approached the smoking, jagged hole in the massive steel door. The interior of the climate-controlled archive was untouched by the violent breach. Just inside the thick metal doorway, resting on a reinforced steel shelf, was a sleek, fireproof lockbox. I reached inside the brightly lit vault and placed my hand on the biometric scanner. The locking mechanism clicked open instantly, recognizing my fingerprint. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek, heavy leather folder. I turned back to face Brad, running my hand smoothly over the expensive leather cover. "You keep mentioning your incredible company, Brad," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the dusty room. "You keep waving the name Apex Capital around as if it makes you completely immune to federal law. You constantly boast about your multi-million-dollar portfolios and wealthy clients. But we both know the truth about how your precious company actually started. You did not build Apex Capital from nothing. You did not pull yourself up by your bootstraps. 3 years ago, you were a failing stockbroker begging every single bank for a business loan, and every single one of them completely rejected your terrible business plan." Brad's eyes darted nervously around the room. He hated anyone bringing up his early failures, especially in front of Desiree and my status-obsessed parents. "That has nothing to do with anything," he snapped defensively. "I found a private angel investor who believed in my ultimate vision. I secured a $10 million seed funding round because I am brilliant. My primary investor understands my immense value." I smiled a predatory smile and slowly opened the sleek leather folder. "Yes, Brad, your primary investor certainly understands exactly what you are," I agreed smoothly. "You secured your massive seed funding from a private anonymous trust entity called Vanguard Heritage. That $10 million injection of capital was the only reason you were able to lease that expensive corner office and start pretending to be a financial genius. You have spent the last 3 years blindly worshipping this mysterious Vanguard Heritage entity." I pulled the crisp top document out of the leather folder and held it up for him to clearly see. The heavy paper bore the official gold foil seal of the Vanguard Heritage Trust. It was the original master funding contract, completely unredacted. "I want you to look very closely at the primary signature line at the bottom of this legally binding document, Brad." I instructed, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly cold whisper. I walked over and held the document directly in front of his sweaty face. Brad squinted at the paper. His bloodshot blue eyes scanned the dense legal text and landed directly on the signature line. He stopped breathing completely. His jaw dropped open and a pathetic whimpering sound escaped his throat. He shook his head, completely unable to process the absolute impossibility of the words written on the page. "That is right, Brad," I said, allowing a small, victorious laugh to escape my lips. "Vanguard. Heritage is not a massive board of wealthy white men sitting in a high-rise office building. It is a private, anonymous blind trust that I completely control. I am the absolute majority shareholder. I am the mysterious angel investor who gave you that $10 million. You have never been a self-made chief executive officer. You have been my unknowing, low-level employee this entire time. I literally own your precious multi-million-dollar company." The federal agent stood perfectly still, watching the incredible financial execution take place in the middle of a destroyed suburban kitchen. Desiree gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands, as the absolute reality of my immense wealth finally shattered her deeply ingrained superiority complex. She had spent her entire life looking down on me, treating my career as a pathetic joke. Now she realized I could buy and sell her perfect husband 10 times over. My father, Marcus, leaned heavily against the dining room wall, his face completely gray. He had aggressively mortgaged his own retirement home to invest $200,000 into Apex Capital, completely believing he was partnering with a financial titan. He was just now realizing that he had indirectly handed his entire life savings right over to the daughter he had cruelly abandoned in a hospital bed. "You arrogant fool," Marcus whispered, staring at Brad with absolute disgust. Brad collapsed entirely, hanging dead weight between the two muscular federal agents. His massive, fragile ego had finally imploded, completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of his absolute financial ruin. He could not hide behind his expensive lawyers because I was the one paying their high hourly retainer fees. He was completely trapped, completely exposed, and entirely owned by the woman he had tried to quietly murder. I was not quite finished dismantling his ruined life yet. The agents grabbed Brad by his shoulders and dragged his limp body out of the kitchen. His leather shoes dragged across the ruined hardwood floor, leaving long streaks in the plaster dust. He did not scream or fight back. The crushing reality of his legal destruction had broken his fragile, arrogant spirit. I watched with immense satisfaction as they hauled him through the entryway and pushed him into a waiting black sport utility vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing his miserable fate forever. The flashing emergency lights reflected off my house as the convoy pulled away from my lawn, carrying my brother-in-law straight to a federal holding cell. I walked back inside my quiet house. The commercial demolition crew had already packed up their industrial equipment and fled the scene, wanting nothing to do with the massive federal crime. The only people left standing in my ruined kitchen were my mother Brenda, my father Marcus, and my weeping sister Desiree. They looked completely pathetic, standing there surrounded by the wreckage of their greedy ambition. My father took a hesitant step toward me, his hands shaking violently. "Zoya, please listen to me," he begged, his voice trembling with fear. "You must understand our terrible position. We mortgaged our entire retirement house to invest that money into Apex Capital. If you liquidate the company and seize the corporate assets, we will lose absolutely everything. We will be completely homeless, Zoya. We are your parents. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." My mother Brenda quickly stepped forward, tears streaming rapidly down her perfectly made-up face. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I took a sharp, deliberate step backward, refusing to let her touch my charcoal gray suit. "We are so incredibly sorry, Zoya," she sobbed, wiping her wet face with trembling fingers. "We made a terrible mistake trusting Brad. We were just so scared and completely overwhelmed by your massive medical bills. Please forgive us, darling. Please just give us back our retirement investment and let Desiree stay here so she can safely raise her new baby." Desiree nodded frantically, rubbing her swollen stomach. "Brad is gone," she cried, her voice thick with panic. "I have no money and no husband. You have to help me, Zoya. You are my big sister. You have to take care of me." I looked at the three of them standing there begging for my hard-earned wealth after they had literally tried to erase my entire existence. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. I only felt a deep, profound emptiness where my familial love used to reside. I stood perfectly straight and looked directly into my father's desperate eyes. "You did not make a simple mistake, Marcus," I said, my voice completely devoid of any human warmth or sympathy. "A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. What you did was highly calculated and utterly ruthless. You walked into my hospital room, looked at your daughter lying helpless in a coma, and you deliberately signed a legal document ordering the doctors to let me die. You signed my actual death warrant so you could save money and buy country club status through a wealthy son-in-law." I turned my cold gaze to my mother and my sister. "And while I was fighting alone in the dark to breathe, you eagerly sold my beautiful home and threw a lavish party to celebrate my demise." I continued, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet, dusty room. "You only care about the concept of family when it provides you a comfortable financial safety net. You are not my family anymore. You are simply strangers who share my genetic sequence, and I owe you absolutely nothing. I will completely liquidate Apex Capital tomorrow morning to recover my investments, and I do not care if the bank forecloses on your precious retirement home. That is the heavy price of your own greedy stupidity." I pointed my manicured finger directly down the long central hallway, pointing straight toward the shattered front door. "I am officially ordering you off my property right now," I commanded with absolute finality. "If any of you ever attempt to contact me or show up at this historic estate again, I will have my lawyers file restraining orders and have you arrested for criminal trespassing. Now get out of my house and never come back." They stared at me in absolute stunned silence, realizing that their emotional manipulation would never work on me again. My father lowered his head in total defeat, placing a shaking hand on my mother's shoulder. They slowly turned around and walked heavily out of the kitchen, their footsteps echoing hollowly against the dusty floorboards. Desiree followed closely behind them, sobbing loudly into her hands, completely shattered by the loss of her wealthy lifestyle. I stood alone in the center of my ruined kitchen, listening to the sound of their cars driving away from my property forever. The house was finally quiet. The massive steel vault door stood open behind me, keeping the priceless historical artifacts completely safe. I had successfully defended my life, my wealth, and my cultural heritage from the people who were supposed to protect me the most. I washed the gray plaster dust from my hands, feeling an incredible sense of absolute freedom wash over my soul. If you are currently suffering under the heavy weight of a highly toxic family, please hear my words carefully. You do not owe your loyalty to people who constantly disrespect your boundaries and actively try to diminish your inherent worth. Blood does not automatically guarantee love, and shared genetics do not give anyone the right to abuse you. Take your power back, build your own secure vault, and never apologize for protecting your peace. Thank you for listening to my journey today. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories about finding ultimate freedom. The harrowing story of Zoya and her ruthless family teaches a profound and painful lesson. Shared genetics do not automatically equate to unconditional love or unwavering loyalty. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood relatives are our ultimate safety net. But Zoya's journey shatters this dangerous illusion completely. When Zoya was at her most vulnerable, fighting for her life in a coma, the people who should have fiercely protected her viewed her merely as an expendable financial asset. Their betrayal was deeply rooted in greed and an obsession with superficial social status. The critical lesson we must take away from this is that you cannot force toxic people to respect your inherent worth, even if they are your own parents or siblings. People often tolerate severe emotional abuse, manipulation, and financial exploitation simply because it comes from relatives clinging to a false hope that they will eventually change. Zoya's story proves that sometimes the only way to truly survive is to stop waiting for apologies that will never come. True family is defined by mutual respect and care, not merely by a shared last name. Furthermore, the story beautifully illustrates the immense power of silent resilience and strict emotional boundaries. Zoya did not win her battle by screaming or matching her family's chaotic, toxic energy. She won by quietly securing her independence, recognizing her own massive value, and ruthlessly cutting off the toxicity when the time was right. Walking away from abusive family members is never an act of selfishness, because it is a vital act of ultimate self-preservation. Healing begins the exact moment you stop setting yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. If you are currently sacrificing your mental health to appease manipulative family members, please take a step back. Evaluate your worth and establish the firm boundaries you need to protect your peace today. The story of Zoya serves as a powerful and uncompromising testament to one of the most difficult but absolutely necessary lessons a person can learn in life. We are constantly conditioned by society to believe that blood relations demand our unconditional loyalty and infinite forgiveness. However, Zoya's journey shatters that dangerous illusion completely. When she was at her absolute most vulnerable, fighting for her life in a hospital bed, the people who should have fiercely protected her viewed her merely as a financial burden and an asset to be ruthlessly exploited. Her parents and sister used their biological connection not to offer love, but to manipulate the law and steal her hard-earned legacy. This brutal betrayal highlights a painful universal truth. Shared genetics do not automatically grant someone a moral compass, nor do they guarantee genuine love or respect. Toxic individuals will frequently use the sacred concept of family as a weapon to maintain their control and extract valuable resources. The ultimate lesson here is the profound necessity of establishing absolute, unshakable boundaries. Zoya did not win her battle by matching their chaotic screaming or begging for their validation. She won by quietly securing her independence, recognizing her immense self-worth, and completely cutting off the toxicity when the time was right. Walking away from abusive family members is never an act of selfishness. It is a vital and courageous act of ultimate self-preservation. You do not owe your life, your wealth, or your peace of mind to people who actively try to diminish your inherent worth. Healing truly begins the exact moment you stop setting your own life on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. If you are currently sacrificing your mental health to appease manipulative family members, please take a step back. Evaluate your true worth and establish the firm boundaries you need to protect your peace today.